The auction hall hummed with polite chatter and bored sighs as a single spotlight found a horse lying motionless at the center of the ring, a chestnut stallion whose coat bore the faded marks of old wounds and a life of neglect, the scars forming a map of past hardship that traced across his flanks and neck. The auctioneer's voice rose and fell, hoping to stir interest, his practiced cadence trying to lift the mood. But the crowd only reacted with detached amusement and thin laughter, comments drifting like dust. "What's the point? That horse isn't worth anything," someone snapped, while a woman in an elegant dress tilted her head and added a remark saturated in scorn. "It looks like he's given up," as if appearance alone could reveal all secrets. Judgments came fast and decisive, heads nodding in agreement, the atmosphere sharpening around disdain. The stallion's eyes were dull, and his posture seemed to accept defeat. An animal broken by years, placed on display in a glittering room that made rejection feel routine. No one in that room spared him a second thought, until an unexpected sound cut through the chatter, a chair scraping back somewhere at the rear, and a young man in plain clothes, oddly out of place amid polished shoes and tailored suits, stood up with a steady, simple declaration. "I'll take him." The words were small, but they landed like a stone thrown into still water, pulling shocked glances in the speaker's direction. A scoff met the announcement, a man in the crowd asking if he was serious, but the young man's attention never left the horse. There was something in his steady look that silenced even the loudest mockery. The room held an uneasy hush as he moved toward the ring, paid, and then, with a quiet determination, crouched to meet the animal's gaze. The stallion flinched but did not turn away. The young man leaned closer and murmured words no one else could hear, a soft cadence meant only for the horse, and to everyone's surprise the stallion's ears twitched, and for the first time that night, he lifted his head. The murmurs changed tone, from ridicule to bewilderment. What was once derision became curiosity, and the story of the rejected chestnut took a turn that no one in that hall could have predicted. The days that followed unfolded like a quiet revolution. News moved through town that the once forgotten horse was beginning to thrive under the care of his unlikely buyer. The transformation was not instant, but it was unmistakable. The animal once labeled worthless started to show reserve strength and a sharp intelligence that had been hidden under layers of fear. His walk became more purposeful, his eyes brightened, and people who had mocked the purchase started to wonder if there had been something more to see all along. The question remained, what had the man done to cause such a change, and why did the connection between them seem so natural, as if their paths had been meant to cross? Answers arrived slowly in the form of patience, small acts, and an unspoken vow to build trust. The early mornings found them at a modest stable warmed by pale sunlight. The young man had named the stallion Phoenix, a fitting title for an animal believed to have the capacity to rise again from the ashes of his past. Phoenix stood awkward at first, his muscles taut, his movements careful. The old scars were visible on his body, and the invisible ones had formed walls around his ability to trust. The new caretaker recognized the task ahead. This was going to be an uphill climb, and yet there was a conviction that the horse was worth every effort. He sat for long hours outside the stall, reading in a low voice or simply sharing the space without attempting to force any contact. Pushing trust would only breed fear. A gentle, steady presence was the necessary pace. In a quiet afternoon when the light slanted through the stable window, Phoenix took a tentative step toward the man. The noise of hooves on straw made the caretaker glance up, heart quickening at the small but significant movement. Phoenix's ears flicked, not in panic but with a note of curiosity that had not been seen before. That breakthrough was fragile, and fragile breakthroughs have a way of revealing deeper challenges. The next morning, when an attempt was made to lead Phoenix out into the pasture, the stallion reared and cried out as the bridle touched his head, and panic cut through the open field like a sudden wind. The man released the reins, hands shaking, but there was no anger, only space, calm words, and time. It was clear that the deeper wounds were not only physical. Phoenix flinched at raised voices and sudden movements. His reactions hinted at a history of betrayal that went beyond simple neglect. As the weeks unfolded, a pattern of slow tries, modest progress, and patient resets emerged. Each small advance revealed fragments of Phoenix's earlier life. He would freeze at unexpected sounds, cower at a flash of motion, and sometimes he would stand absolutely still, as if a memory had taken him hostage. Those moments sparked a quiet anger in the man who had seen the condition Phoenix had been left in. The idea that someone could have treated a living creature with such indifference was hard to swallow. But that anger never became a burden on Phoenix. Instead, it fueled the caretaker's silent vow. Every cruel memory would be replaced by small, consistent acts of kindness. One evening, colors of orange and purple painted the sky and a new approach was tried. A brush was brought out and the man moved slowly, deliberately. At first, Phoenix tightened into a defensive stance, but the gentle stroked rhythmically across his coat began to work its way inside the animal's fortress of mistrust. A soft exhale escaped, the rigid set of his muscles eased, and for that fleeting moment it felt like a hinge that had been stuck for years finally giving way. It was a small victory, but monumental in its implications. That change began to ripple outward through town. Some people who had once laughed now watched with a kind of cautious wonder. Others remained skeptics. As dusk drew close, the caretaker continued to stand beside Phoenix, brushing and breathing, and feeling a quiet flicker of hope. Yet there was a sense that this was only the opening chapter of a much longer story. The days settled into routine. The man rose before dawn, his boots crunching over gravel as he walked to the stable. Phoenix learned to recognize the sound and would nick softly when the caretaker appeared, a guarded acceptance in his eyes rather than blind trust. That steady presence was the backbone of progress, and the caretaker treasured each glance, each hoof step taken without hesitation. One particular afternoon, the decision was made to push a boundary just a little further. They walked together into the open pasture, sunlight painting the fields gold. Phoenix hesitated at the edge, hooves rooted as if anchored by invisible doubt. No pressure was applied. The man stood beside him and let the horse set his own pace. A careful step. Another. It was as if Phoenix was learning to recover a freedom that had been taken from him. But calm does not always last. A sudden loud crack split the air, and the sound, as small as it might have seemed to an onlooker, sent Phoenix into a panic. He bolted, a flight reflex from memories buried in his muscles, and the man had to run after him, shouting his name, trying to bring the horse back from a world of imagined threats. The animal raced like someone fleeing ghosts. When the man finally reached him near the boundary of the field, breathless and shaking, his voice was steady and firm as he reassured the stallion that danger had been replaced by safety. That evening, as the caretaker sat exhausted outside the stable, a retired rancher approached, an older man who had observed the small changes for weeks. He commended the young man's heart and then, in the same breath, warned of the limits of goodwill when the origin of the damage was unknown. If someone wanted to truly help, they would need to understand where the cracks came from. The words lodged in the mind and sat heavy through the night. Questions multiplied. What had Phoenix suffered who had left him so broken, and why had no one stepped in earlier? Determination crystallized into a decision to seek answers. The next morning, the caretaker watched Phoenix with renewed resolve in his gaze and a quiet decision to find out the truth of the stallion's past. The search began at the worn auction house where the horse had first been sold. The manager was a gruff man, indifferent at first, but eventually he produced an old file with a brief description and the name of a prior owner. Victor Harland. An address was scrawled on the page, a ranch on the town's outskirts. The file was thin and offered little comfort, but it provided a lead, one that could not be ignored. The drive to Harland's property was long, and the scene that awaited confirmed the worst fears. The fence lines sagged and the barn doors hung loose, a clear sign of neglect. A weathered man appeared on the porch. His face was hardened, his eyes sharp but lacking warmth. He greeted questions with a defensive bark and dismissive comments, denying responsibility, insisting that the horse had always been too weak, too unsuited for work, as if such deficiencies justified mistreatment. Under persistent questioning, the walls of denial began to crack. Harland admitted that the horse had been part of a string of animals forced to labor, pushed until they broke. When it became obvious the animal could not continue, Harland had simply sent him to auction. The confession came with a flat shrug and a hint of shame. The caretaker left the ranch with a heavier heart and more understanding. The cruelty Phoenix had endured now had a name, but the knowledge only strengthened the determination to provide a different life. Back at the stable that evening, hands smoothing along the stallion's flank, a voice soft and raw with feeling promised that the days of pain were over, that no one would ever treat Phoenix the same way again. The stallion responded by turning his head, making eye contact in a way he had not before. Trust was growing, slow and fragile, but it was real. The past had been uncovered, yet it continued to cast a long shadow. The image of Harland's indifferent face remained, but the caretaker refused to let it define Phoenix's future. Gentle words, steady presence, and careful training became the daily rituals. A veterinarian named Claire, who had heard whispers about the recovery, visited and made an assessment. She pointed out areas of physical tension that reflected deeper trauma, explaining that a body can remember pain long after the mind has moved on. She offered a structured plan, exercises, stretches, and a tailored approach to rebuilding strength without re-traumatizing the horse. The caretaker welcomed the expertise and worked alongside her guidance, integrating slow, patient stretches and movements that encouraged Phoenix to use his muscles in new, healthy ways. During those sessions, a profound moment arrived. Under the glow of barn lights and the hush of evening, Phoenix leaned into the brush and closed his eyes slightly, a small sign of contentment. It was not a cure, but it was evidence, physical proof that the animal was responding to kindness. Just when things seemed to be settling into a hopeful rhythm, a knock on the barn door introduced a new element to the story. A man appeared, his steps measured and eyes focused. He identified himself as someone who had worked with Victor Harland, a person who knew more about the horses Harland had handled and about their potential. The arrival felt like a ripple of uncertainty. The stranger's name was Carter, and he spoke in a voice that held both regret and recognition. He said the stallion was not merely resilient. He had been bred and trained for endurance, pushed beyond reasonable limits, and had had the potential to be remarkable if only his training had been humane. Carter admitted that he had once stood on the sidelines, that he had not spoken out against Harland, and that guilt had lived with him since. He came now with knowledge and skills, not to take the horse away, but to offer help, if the caretaker would accept it. It was an uneasy alliance. The caretaker, committed to Phoenix's well-being, agreed on one condition. Phoenix's needs must come first. Carter respected the stipulation, and over the following days he demonstrated groundwork techniques designed to restore confidence without pressure. The exercises were subtle, relying on calm commands, measured movements, and trust building that encouraged the horse to choose to follow rather than be led. Phoenix reacted with wary curiosity at first, then increasingly with steadiness. The man watched and learned, absorbing techniques to use himself. With time and repetition, the stallion began to move with more grace, neck more relaxed, steps more assured, yet emotional wounds still surfaced. Flashbacks arrived like brief storms. Startling noises or sudden movements could bring fear back to the surface. The caretaker refused to let those moments undo the progress, holding firm and patient as the horse worked through each tremor of memory. Then Carter spoke of a possibility that made the caretaker's stomach turn, returning to a track. Carter believed that facing a racetrack, not in the sense of racing for competition, but in order to help the horse reclaim a part of himself, could be therapeutic. The idea felt risky and was met with resistance. The memory of the place where Phoenix had been pushed to collapse made the suggestion feel dangerous. Still, Carter proposed a gentle option. A private track outside of town where the environment could be controlled, where crowds and pressure would be absent. A place to let Phoenix explore the sensations of movement at speed in safety. With careful preparation, small changes in routine, exposure to similar sounds, and patient rehearsal, the day came to drive to the quiet track. Loading Phoenix into a trailer was a test of nerve, but with coaxing he stepped aboard. The drive was quiet, the air full of an anxious expectancy. Carter was already waiting by the fence when they arrived, arms relaxed and expression calm. Unloading was slow, each step measured. Phoenix surveyed the unfamiliar expanse with cautious wariness, hooves pausing as he took in the sight and sound of a place that could have held trauma. The caretaker kept one hand on the horse's neck, whispering steady reassurances. The first lap was tentative, a walk paced more like a test than a triumph, but with each circuit Phoenix grew steadier, the rhythm of his stride finding a new confidence. By the third lap his gait was unmistakably stronger. There was a steadiness in his head carriage and a purposeful reach in his movement. Emotions flooded the caretaker then, relief, pride, and a deeply held sense that the horse was reclaiming something vital. Yet the quiet track's success was only the beginning. Carter warned that the real test would come in facing a full racetrack with its echoes, its bustle, and its noises that had once been triggers. The caretaker wrestled with dread and hope, but there was a clear recognition that this next step could further cement Phoenix's progress or threaten to unravel it. Preparation involved recreating track noises, introducing unfamiliar equipment gradually, and slowly building the stallion's tolerance for chaos. Each day Phoenix showed a little more resilience. He reacted to recordings of cheering and to the mechanical clatter of track gear with unease at first, then with a waning tension. When the day for the real track arrived, the stands were empty but the space itself was vast and echoing. A starting bell rang and for a moment, fear threatened to swallow the progress. Phoenix reared, heart pounding, but the caretaker remained calm, holding the lead with a steady hand and reassuring words. Breathing slowed, hooves settled, and then one guarded step at a time he moved forward. They completed a lap, then another, and by the halfway point the horse's movements were more fluid. The joy that shone in that steady stride was not about speed. It was about the return of power under his own feet. Exiting the track, Carter offered a rare smile and described the day as a pivotal step. Word of the stallion's success spread through town and beyond. Former skeptics started to speak in tones that bordered on admiration, calling Phoenix a symbol of resilience. The caretaker, however, saw the change as something much less performative. The work had never been an attempt to prove a point. It had been a promise to an animal who had been failed by people, a vow to replace fear with kindness and to create a new life built on patient trust. As the months settled, small signs of transformation accumulated. Phoenix moved with a confidence that had once seemed impossible. Claire, the veterinarian, touched his neck one afternoon and said plainly that the stallion's spirit had returned, that the horse now showed the kind of vitality that signaled deep recovery. The story resonated in the community. Schools invited talks about compassion and resilience, and events gathered to celebrate how patients could heal. At a gathering, a young boy asked, wide-eyed, whether the stallion had truly been broken before. The caretaker simply knelt and answered that Phoenix had never been irreparably broken. He had been abandoned and needed someone who believed he could be whole again. On a quiet evening, as the sun dipped low and the pasture was bathed in gold, the caretaker stood beside Phoenix and felt the full weight of the journey. The bond was now undeniable, forged from hardship, repair, and mutual trust. Carter, who had stayed close since his initial arrival, leaned on the split-rail fence and posed a gentle question: what now? The caretaker looked to Phoenix, not to his own ambitions, and decided that the next step belonged to the horse. Choice, after all, was a part of the healing. Over time, the stallion made subtle changes almost unnoticed at first: a steadier head, a more expansive stride, a look in his eyes that no longer flickered with constant apprehension. Phoenix had found a way to move through the world with dignity. The community's admiration was not an end in itself. It was a reflection of how one life returned from the edge could inspire others. A thorough doctoring by Claire confirmed physical improvements and outlined a long-term plan to keep Phoenix healthy, strong, and free to choose his own future. The story spread, touching people in unexpected ways. Invitations came to share the tale of recovery, not as a showpiece, but as a lesson in patience and compassion. The stallion's presence became a quiet catalyst for small acts of kindness that rippled through the town in its own gentle way. At a public event, a child's question again summarized the larger truth: had Phoenix really been broken? The simple answer given was that he had been damaged, not destroyed, and what he needed was someone to believe in his capacity to heal. As the sun slid beyond the horizon and the evening cooled, the two silhouettes of horse and caretaker moved slowly back toward the stable. The bond between them was solid, tested by fear, mended by effort, and strengthened by victories both large and small. The stallion's rescue was not a story of immediate magic, but a testament to what steady care, patience, and respect can do for a being that was wrongly cast aside. The future remained open, full of possibility and choice, and both caretaker and horse stepped into it together, side by side, ready for whatever might come next. If this story stirred something in the heart, consider supporting these kinds of second chances by subscribing, liking, and sharing so more people can witness how care and patience can change a life.